It is 10:32 on my clock. We should be done by 11 o'clock. I'll just do some introduce our pollster, Jim, and then I'll cover some points and open up the question and answer. My name is Paul Craney. I'm the Executive Director of the Fiscal Alliance Foundation. The Fiscal Alliance Foundation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization whose mission is to promote individual liberty and a more fiscally responsible, transparent government for a better New England through education and legal assistance. We've been doing public polling since 2019, and this is our first poll of the year. It also happens to be, from what I can gather, the first statewide poll of likely voters. On the Zoom is our pollster, Jim, a Massachusetts native. He's going to open it up, and then I'm going to say some comments with the poll, and then open up to Q&A. You should all on this call have a copy of the poll, the press release, and we will make all that information public at the end of this Zoom. So thank you for joining. Jim, if you don't mind, take it from here.
Thanks very much, Paul, and thanks everyone for joining. We have as Paul said, our first poll of the year and our first poll of the cycle, and our first poll since the 2024 cycle ended. So it's interesting to see now we're 3 months after, or 3 months into the new year, where everything is shaken out. And we looked at, as you guys can see from the questions, we looked at a number of issues surrounding new taxes, issues before the legislature, and issues that maybe come before the voters, as well as the favorability or unfavorability of a couple of statewide officials, and looking ahead a little bit to 2026. Looking at some of the issue questions that we asked, we see a real strong thread of anti-tax sentiment. 57% of respondents to the poll said they were in favor of repealing the state tax, 57% repealing the vehicle excise tax, even 49% beginning a repeal of the top income and capital gains tax. And then when you start talking about the possibility of new taxes, that's when you really start seeing some strong reactions. The strongest reaction we saw was an opposition to the prescription assessment. 83% opposed that, and 78% opposing giving towns the chance to raise the vehicle excise tax. And of course, like about 2/3 strong or somewhat favorable towards Proposition 2.5, limiting property tax increases. So the real strong thoroughfare of people kind of saying, we're not into paying more taxes, which is not overly surprising, especially given kind of the economic environment in general. To have people say, well, look, that's enough. That's not something that is totally surprising, but it's nice to have numbers to put to it. Now, the thing that was interesting to me, we were looking at, as I mentioned, we took a few we checked the favorability or non-favorability of, obviously, the president, Governor Healey, and Senator Ed Markey, and looking at kind of where they fell. And that's a good question, especially at the beginning of a poll, to kind of get people in. Like, what do you think about, these people? But then when we started looking at the Senate election in 2026, we saw some points of, what if I would be concerned if I was Senator Markey, where he has a pretty good, strong overall favorability, decent favorability, I should say, about 55%. And then, about the same for Governor Healey. But then when you start asking questions about whether or not he should seek re-election, as he's announced his intention to do, people are a little more tepid on that. 55% think he shouldn't seek re-election. And then when you put him in a hypothetical matchup with someone like Governor Healey, he loses 35 to 21%. And if you put him up against Congressman Auchincloss, it's more of a dead heat, but a lot of undecideds, and a lot of undecideds in both of those. What's really interesting is when you start drilling down and looking at where people come out on those issues. Looking at Democrats, 78% of Democrats are favorable to Markey. No surprise there. But only 42% think he should seek reelection. And that's the only subset where he wins that question, where people think he should seek reelection. Healey leads among Democrats, 44 to 24%. And then if you start looking at people who are favorable towards Markey, people who say in question 3 that they are strongly or somewhat favorable, Healey leads among them, 47 to 21%. And even among strongly favorable Markey supporters, Healey leads 41 to 28%. So you look at all these, and this is early on, so it's at this point you're looking at trying to figure out how voters are starting to form their opinions of the 2026 election, but they're not in the ballot booth yet. They're not making a choice or in front of a mail-in ballot or anywhere else. But you're starting to see the mindset, and the mindset is shaping up that while people are respectful and supportive of Senator Markey, there's an openness to a challenger. And in this case, Governor Healey is already a very formidable challenger, has a lot of name recognition, but even somebody like Congressman Auchincloss or someone else who challenges on the Democratic side may have some very good, be able to make some very good inroads. There's an old saying in politics, of course, you can't beat somebody with nobody. So it has to be somebody who makes those inroads, but there's a path. And that's something that's interesting to see this early in the process. And that was the very interesting thing I saw, because I mean, when you see that someone has a pretty good favorability rating of 55%, but then 55% are also saying you shouldn't seek reelection. That's something that piques your interest, and one of the fun parts of analyzing these polls. And that was the main thing that I saw or the main points that I saw that were pretty interesting to me, that jumped off the page.
I'm just going to dovetail a little bit from what Jim said. So I have the poll in front of me. I just wanted to go through some points. We don't need to rehash the Trump numbers. I think it's just safe to say that his numbers look very similar to what he got last November. People haven't really moved to Massachusetts. Looking at the Healey poll numbers, there was a poll done by UMass that was of residents, not likely voters. Our poll shows something similar. But going to Markey, I had to Google this other day. When did he get elected? And I was actually surprised, 1974. So he's running 1973 to 74. So he's been in office in Massachusetts, state legislator, congressman, senator for over a half a century at this point. So, if I was elected for over a half a century, I would say, maybe this poll doesn't look great. Maybe it's not real bad if you're looking at just favorables, but it does say something for someone being in office for so long, how the voters kind of view him. And speaking of the 70s, we also wanted to poll Proposition 2.5, because that actually came up in 1978 and passed in 1980. And you can see in that one where the voters kind of view this as almost like a classic. It just doesn't go out of style. Very large margin of support. And even looking at Democrat, Republican, Independent voters, it is very much favored there. Something to look at with the head-to-head, the hypothetical with Markey and Warren. Jim mentioned with Democrat voters, but it's also true with independent voters. Independent voters prefer Governor Healey over Ed Markey for the Senate seat. So I have to imagine the senator is kind of aware of this. I have to imagine Governor Healey is also aware of this, and there could be an opportunity there for her, for someone like Auchincloss. And Auchincloss also, I think he's slightly ahead amongst independents, which are unenrolled voters in Massachusetts. We asked some questions about ICE, law enforcement, immigration issues. You can read that for yourself. It seems like it's pretty much a dead heat in Massachusetts for people's views. We touched on some of the tax issues, the state tax and the excise tax to repeal. Don't need to rehash that. One thing I want to point out is that it has very low response to keep it. So it kind of shows you there's really not a lot of loyalty for these taxes. I do want to talk about the prescription drug tax because it was an answer that hit in the 80s. And that's really hard to get a poll answer in the 80s. You almost never really see it. In fact, we only had 2 questions that got in the 80s in this poll. And this was one of them. And it's the only tax question. So it really shows you that when you're getting into 80s, you really have to carry pretty much every single entire demographic pretty hard. And in this case, it did. It carried Republicans, Democrats, Independents overwhelmingly. So that kind of, I think, is the reason why we never heard Governor Healey disclose in her budget that she had this tax. It was something that had to be found, and it's for good reason. It's not popular. It's an 80-20 issue. So legislators should be very cautious of this if they want to include this in the legislative budget before the State House, because it is not popular with the public. We have a voter ID question that is kind of as expected, 60-30. And obviously the party breakdown on that type of question is pretty hard. Democrats don't support it, Republicans and Independents do. We did ask a question about ranked choice voting. This is a ballot question that was put before the voters in 2020. It was defeated 55-45. Proponents tried to put it on the ballot last cycle. It was defeated before the Attorney General's office. In full disclosure, the Fiscal Alliance Foundation was the entity that challenged it there and successfully got it kicked off the ballot. So we wanted to see if there was any appetite for this type of idea again after being rejected by the voters 5 years ago and proponents still trying to put it forward, and they could try to put it forward the next cycle. And it really doesn't have any support. About 29% support it. If you look at the party registration in the poll, Independents, Republicans do not support it, with majorities that don't support it. And then even amongst Democrats, it's about a 30-30-30 issue. A third support it, a third don't, a third don't know. So if you're looking at ballot questions, that's not a good spot to start. And the proponents of that, even though they make a lot of noise, it's always good to see what do the voters think after 5 years in a ballot question that they soundly defeated, and nothing has changed. It is not popular. We asked a question about, speaking of ballot questions, question number 1 from last year, audit the legislature. And just to refresh, that passed with 72% of the vote. Every city and town voted in favor of it. I don't recall ever seeing a ballot question pass so high. And I was kind of wondering, well, what do people think about it now after we've heard from legislative leaders, we've heard from who don't want to comply, we've heard from the Attorney General who doesn't feel obligated to enforce the law, and it actually came in higher. Again, to my surprisement, 81% say they think Attorney General Andrea Campbell should enforce the law. With this question, one thing that really stuck out too was not only did it carry all Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, but it was the Independents who had the strongest feeling on this question. You don't really see that in polls. It's usually one of the 2 parties that have the strongest feelings, and Independents kind of go where the majority goes. In this case, the Independents are leading with their feelings on this issue. Slightly, but still it stuck out. So if I was the Attorney General, I'd be pretty careful with this one. I think she should obviously follow the law, enforce the voter-proof law. But if she has any future aspirations in politics, even if she's suing Trump 5 days a week, this could be something that could come back and haunt her. So perhaps it's time for her to spend a day in Massachusetts and enforce this law with the lawsuit.
Hey, Paul, I'm sorry. I just wanted to jump in with one thing. One thing I kind of looked at was people who were strongly or somewhat unfavorable toward Trump. Also, that's like 79% to 8%. support the AG following this law. Sorry to jump in there, but that was just one
No,
thing that,
yeah,
that it's kind of a common sense, follow the law type of question.
yeah, definitely. Jim talked about rolling back the surtax, and we wanted to ask another kind of unusual question. I think it's kind of pertinent to the days we live in now, which is the whole debate about, Massachusetts and how it gets its energy and energy prices. And obviously, Governor Healey, as AG, worked really hard to stop the pipelines. She bragged about it on the campaign trail, and seems like that's kind of coming back to haunt her. And Massachusetts, of course, is following a mandate which everyone in the State House seems to support for the most part, which are creating a lot of these high prices. So we asked, a question of basically more pipelines or full commitment to renewable energy. And there wasn't a clear majority pick, but it did show that the preference was more pipeline. And I think that's kind of telling where people are starting to kind of go with the energy issue for Massachusetts and New England. And it did carry a majority for independent voters, which I think is also worthwhile to note. These are the people that, if you're thinking about running for office in Massachusetts, you need to carry a majority to win, and a majority of independent voters have a preference, not a plurality, a majority for more pipeline. So with that, I'm gonna open up to questions. If you can, just make sure to unmute yourself. Most of you have your name on your page, but definitely feel free to say your name and the org you work for.
Hey, good morning. Nobody's going, so I will go first. I'm Soraya Wintersmith with GBH News. We skipped over the ICE and immigration questions. It's looking like it's a dead heat. Can I get one of you to comment on that?
Jim, what do you think?
So I'm just making sure that I've got the numbers in front of me. So, um, yeah, there's we did two of them. We did the favorable and unfavorable. So it's 44 favorable, stronger somewhat, and then and just about the same, 44, 45, somewhat or strongly unfavorable, that was interesting to me that was as high as it was. Um, the favorability was as high. Um, and and the whether lawmakers should change state law to allow local law enforcement to cooperate with immigration officials. Um, also a dead heat with, or not dead heat, but maybe a little bit, yeah, dead heat because we're within MOE. Um, the you know, it's something where if we've pulled a little bit on, the migrant crisis and how it's affected the state, and how state policies have um, maybe exacerbated effects that otherwise would be minimal, and the state's just kind of making it worse. Um, and so I think we see a couple of things, and it's a little bit of looking at the trend line and saying, okay, it's dead even, and um, these are not things that I would expect in a state like Massachusetts to see dead even. I would think that there'd be a little bit more antipathy toward ICE. There would be a little bit, um, a little bit more hesitancy to change state law to permit cooperation. There may also be some question about how much people know about what the state law is or isn't. Um, so to me, looking at those numbers being so even, it's probably things that if we had asked those questions 5 years ago or 10 years ago, it might come out differently, and you might have more, um, a more tepid support for ICE, or more hesitancy to cooperate with immigration officials. And now, after seeing some of the effects that the state and the I want to say, um, the additional responsibilities that the state has taken on, as a result of trying to shut out these entities, that people are more likely to support ICE within the state, and they're more likely to say, let's cooperate with immigration officials. Um, and if you look on you dig down into crosstabs, and I know we always like to look at where the independents kind of fall on this. Um, you know, Independents, it's 48% or 49% to 37 or 38%, um, more on the favorable toward ICE. And they're more likely to, about the same percentage, believing that they should change state laws um, to affect. So it's more of kind of I think it's one of those things where it's surprising that it's as close as it is. You see a lot of people within Massachusetts who are kind of more supportive of additional action, enforcing immigration policy. But you also have a fair amount of Democrats who are kind of saying, well, no, this is a partisan issue, so I'm not going to support it. And we see a few other places like that, where it breaks like that, where independents think one way and Democrats kind of toe more of a partisan line. But I think that's what you see at play here. Does that answer? Or Paul, do you have something to add to that?
No, that was perfect. Thank you. There is a question here in the chat, Olivia, so I'm just going to read it for the group. She says she can't unmute herself, unfortunately, but on the audit question, lawmakers have said that while voters favor an audit, they won't go out and fight for enforcement. Do these poll results prove them wrong? Are you expecting advocacy groups of people answering polls? Yeah, I think this question and the ballot question definitely proves legislators wrong. And then expecting advocacy outside of people answering polls. I think there are some advocacy groups pushing for the law to be followed. But yeah, when you get into 80%, I think it's a very strong feeling, especially when you're carrying all three major parties in every demographic. So I think people have very, very strong feelings about that ballot question. And I said in the beginning, it's actually independents that are with the strongest feelings on that question, which is kind of unusual. I haven't really seen that often.
Another.
Okay. I was just going to say, the Speaker, Senate President, and the Attorney General, that one would kind of haunt me if I was in their situation.
And I think there's also, it might not be something that, people start leaving their houses and carrying signs down the street and that kind of advocacy. But when you start having something like this, you worry that voters are going to not feel heard. And that's the type of thing that erodes, confidence in an elected official, and it erodes confidence in institutions. So there's definitely an effect there, even if you don't see it from people, leaving their house and chanting right away. Um, that has an effect.
Yeah, definitely.
Hi, thank you guys for doing this. Kelly Garrity with Politico. Just had a question about the how the poll was conducted. Are the ways the questions are written in the top lines PDF how they were presented to people? And then just curious if there's anything more you can say specifically about how it was conducted, whether it was over the phone, text, whatever.
I can answer that. It was conducted over the phone. And we did a mix of about 50-50. We did a few landlines and mobiles. We want to make sure we have a good cross section of mobiles and then fill out with with landlines as we need. Um, the Although it's getting easier to reach people by cell phone. Um, and the I have to see I don't know. I've seen the PDF that
Yeah,
she's talking about, Paul, but I know that we have the one I'm looking at right now has abbreviated questions, so I know we've had more extended questions that kind of explain things. Um,
yeah, the questions should be all the same.
okay.
But Kelly, if you need, we could send you the questions a Word doc if it's easier for, copy and paste or just to review it. But hopefully that answers your
I'll
question.
send you an email. Thanks.
Okay. And then John from Mass Live asks on the chat, what's a partisan split on the sample? And I think the answer is at the end of the document that you have, but could just answer that question too.
Yeah,
Democratic
I don't
voters.
think I don't think I saw that. I'm sorry.
Okay. It's answer number 19. So percentage wise, likely voters, but 41% Dem, 11% Republican, 48% independent, which is unenrolled.
Sorry, got it. Thanks, appreciate it.
No problem. I want to be mindful everyone's time. I was hoping to wrap up by 11. Are there any other closing questions? All right. Well, we can finish a minute early. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We'll put out a press release, and this interview will be on the Fiscal Alliance's YouTube page later today. If you have any follow-up questions, just feel free to reach out. Thank you, Jim.